What if the most feared king in history didn't go mad, but knew something the world wasn't meant to find? Centuries ago, a ruler believed he was made of glass. He feared human touch, trusted no reflection, and claimed the walls of his palace whispered betrayal. But then, without warning, he ordered his entire castle burned. Not by enemy hands, his own. The fire consumed archives, bloodlines, and voices. Ministers vanished. Courtiers died, locked inside. What could have driven a monarch to erase his legacy in flame? Madness or something far worse? Some say he destroyed ancient prophecies. Others believe he was hiding a cursed truth, one that rewrote who really held power in the kingdom. There were documents never meant to exist, heirlooms from forbidden cults, books that chanted back when read aloud. Historians tried to bury it, but charred fragments still surface. Whispers persist, and the place where it all happened, it's sealed, but not silent. This isn't a legend. It's the part of history they made sure you'd never learn in school, because sometimes the most dangerous thing a king can do is remember what the rest of the world was forced to forget. Once there ruled a king whose crown weighed not in gold but in fear. His kingdom was one of silence, choked by superstition, laced with suspicion. Whispers began when he stopped allowing people to touch him. Then came the guards with cushions, walking beside him, for he believed his body was made of glass. One fall, one graze, and he'd shatter forever. This was not metaphor, it was law in his court. Anyone who disobeyed was exiled or vanished. Doctors claimed exhaustion, priests called it possession. Courtiers only nodded, speaking little, watching their ruler descend into something unrecognizable. He no longer addressed his ministers but muttered to the air, pausing mid-sentence to nod at invisible figures only he could see. He stopped sleeping in beds, choosing to rest upright in a room filled with mirrors, convinced that only by watching himself could he be safe from the shadows. Creeping behind him, the palace responded by sealing its windows and draping its corridors in velvet, hoping the darkness would not reflect his unraveling mind. Royal scribes began omitting his decrees, labeling them confidential or delirious entries. Even his children were kept from him, raised in other wings as if he were a contagious wound. And yet, his madness carried intelligence, a sharp, poisonous clarity. He remembered every slight, recorded every gaze held too long, every pause in conversation. Ministers found with notes suggesting betrayal vanished. One by one, familiar voices disappeared from the palace halls, replaced by silence and the slow creak of doors that never quite shut. The king began to fear the walls themselves. He claimed they listened, said they pulsed at night. He demanded they be scrubbed with salt and blessed twice a day. When the clergy objected, 3 of them were found drowned in the well. No one questioned the coincidence, not anymore. It wasn't just fire, it was awe. Something inhuman seemed to radiate from him now. A man unraveling by the hour, yet gripping power more tightly than ever. His madness became doctrine, his fear a policy, his delusion a kingdom's rulebook. And beneath the velvet and gold, the entire realm held its breath. Because when glass breaks, it doesn't ask permission. It simply shatters and cuts everything around it. The fire began without warning. No bell was rung, no servants summoned, only a single order, spoken just once, and obeyed without hesitation. The king's paranoia had reached its final threshold. He claimed the palace had turned against him, that the bricks whispered at night, that the portraits watched him when he turned away. He no longer trusted ink or parchment, believing them to be vessels for unseen eyes. And so he gave a command that would erase centuries. Flames consumed East Wing first, the treasury, the private archives, the ancestral vault. Rooms that held secrets passed through generations now vanished in rising smoke. Some say he stood silently as the ceiling collapsed behind him, murmuring about purifying the bloodline. Others insist he was chanting verses not found in any holy book. No one dared ask which was true. Truth had long been outlawed in that place. Noblemen ran, their titles turned to ash in their hands. Courtiers pleaded from windows as the fire climbed higher, indifferent to rank or favor. The guards who once shielded him with velvet now dragged bodies out through smoke, but not all were rescued. Some were locked in intentionally. The king believed they had been infected with ideas, with secrets, with voices. What he truly feared burned with them. The records of ancient pacts, the lineages no longer spoken of. A particular chamber, known only to a few, had no windows, and was lined with books bound in flesh and gold. That room was the first to go. When asked later why he destroyed the histories, he answered only, because they remembered what I was made to forget. And then he ordered the fires to stop. Not when the palace was ash, not when the screams had ended, but precisely when the only wing left untouched was the one that held his newly revised laws, his sealed declarations, and a solitary room where no one but he entered. The room without mirrors. The one built underground. In that silence that followed, survivors dared not speak his name. The kingdom was not ruled by a man anymore, but by a fire that still burned behind his eyes. A fire that didn't consume everything, only what he no longer wished to exist. After the flames faded, ash settled over a silence too heavy for breath. Yet what was truly lost that night wasn't gold or stone, it was memory. The archives had been more than royal records. They were a vault of forbidden knowledge, locked away under generations of deception. Behind those sealed doors were volumes never listed in inventories, some written in languages no scholar dared translate, others inscribed in mirrored script, read only by candlelight and reflection. Among the most whispered was a text known only as the Mirror Gospel, said to be penned by a monk who vanished the day after its completion. The book detailed visions of rulers not yet born, kingdoms already forgotten, and rituals that mirrored royal coronations but ended in silence and fire. It described a bloodline watched by an invisible order, chosen not for virtue but for a curse. The king knew this, and some believe he was not mad but trying to silence what he could not destroy. There were treaties with unnamed forces, inked in red wax, hidden beneath cathedral floors. Some claimed the monarchy had once struck a pact to protect the land from a darker inheritance, one sealed with fire and sealed again by silence. Burning the archives wasn't madness, it was prevention, the only way to keep what was buried from rising again. One chamber, in particular, was believed to hold the truth about succession, a document naming a different heir, born of a line erased from official history. The fire consumed that too. No copy, no witness, only rumors spoken by those who suddenly left the court and never returned. The king did not speak of it afterward, but his eyes were different, no longer fearful, just empty. In later years, when scholars tried to rebuild what had been lost, they discovered omissions so deliberate they formed their own kind of map. The entire decades were missing from family trees. Council records ended mid, and every record of the royal physicians who had treated the king vanished entirely, as if they had never existed. What remained were fragments, burnt pages, melted seals, scorched tapestries depicting events no one could place, each a clue that something far older than the king had been buried in those walls, and in burning it all, he hadn't erased history, he'd simply hidden the warning. Asterisk, the kingdom never recovered. Not truly. After the fire, it wore the same crown, flew the same banners, but the soul of the realm had been hollowed out. The king withdrew into the last standing wing of the palace, surrounded by stone walls polished to reflect nothing. He outlawed music, banned celebrations, and declared silence the language of loyalty. Messengers delivered notes through slits in the door. No one saw his face again. What ruled now was not a man but a memory that refused to die in the following years. The land was struck by a series of disasters. Crops failed, rivers dried, animals turned on their masters, superstition returned with force. People whispered that the king had not destroyed secrets but awakened them. Some believed the archives held more than knowledge, perhaps something sentient, now loosed by fire. There were sightings near the ruins, figures without shadows, walls that bled in the rain, children who claimed to hear voices in their sleep, reciting names they'd never been taught. What remained of the royal line began to vanish, some into distant monasteries, others declared illegitimate and exiled. By the time the king died, no heir stood to claim the throne publicly. The crown passed to a distant cousin, one who refused to live in the old palace and had it sealed completely. A chapel was later built on the grounds, but the stones were always cold. Pilgrims visited it not to pray, but to listen. They said the ground still whispered. Some never returned. Over the centuries, stories turned to myth. The king became a cautionary tale, a symbol of delusion and destruction, but fragments kept surfacing, odd relics found in auction houses, journals written in mirrored Latin, oil paintings where the subject had no face. One historian claimed to have located a surviving piece of the Mirror Gospel, but burned it days later without explanation. Another went silent after a visit to the chapel site. His final entry read, "He didn't go mad, he went ahead." Even now, those who study that reign speak carefully. They avoid dates. They don't use the king's real name, because, in some places it's said his legacy still listens, not in books or ruins but in bloodlines, and when it hears itself spoken aloud, it remembers, not with rage, with return.